Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Jack Threlfall Show. This is the interview segment for episode 34, and we are joined by a very, very special guest, Tom Chamberlain. Welcome to the show, Tom.
Thank you, Jack. Hi, everyone. I'm a mechanical engineering student currently studying at the University of Bath, and I've just finished a placement year in the Vehicle Performance Group at Williams Racing.
Fantastic. That sounds like a really special role. Do you remember when it was you first heard about the role and where your kind of passion for maybe working in Formula One started?
So I first heard about the role kind of in the summer, going between first and second years of university. So I was looking for a placement that I knew would really push me, kind of keep me engaged for the whole of the year, because quite often you hear about students that go out on placement year and they find a lot of the time they're bored, they don't have enough to do. So kind of looking into F1, it's an industry that lots of engineers aspire to work in, and it's the forefront of design, production, and the area that really intrigued me was the kind of the data side of stuff, and that's where vehicle performance really drew me in.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like when you view F1, it's this really cool balance of, the drivers are kind of at the peak of what's presented to us, the talent of the sport. But when you peel that back and you look at the scale of the teams and just how many people are putting every day into making these cars as good as they can be, and it's not just the cars too, it's the team members and the pit stops, all sorts of that stuff. Are you a lifelong F1 fan? Has this always been a dream for you, or is it something you liked more and more the more you learned about it?
So I'm not actually, I wouldn't describe myself as a lifelong F1 fan. I generally followed it kind of growing up, but definitely not to the extent of some of the colleagues that I worked with the past year. But I found as soon as I got into the role, kind of as soon as I got a taste for what could be done, what F1 was all about, and the passion that everyone working there had, it captivated me, and it just grew and grew, that the passion for F1. And I've now kind of come to the end of my year and I'm all over it. I love it so much now.
So what was the first day at the factory like? Do you remember, were their nerves going into it? I'm sure people can anticipate, even people that are lifelong F1 fans, what it might be like stepping into that factory for the first time, crossing that barrier of not being a fan, but being on the inside of a Formula One team. Do you remember that day, first day at the factory?
I do remember the first day. Yeah, I remember being very nervous, as I feel you would be going into any job. Kind of purely having the introductions to some of the team and meeting some of the people that I'll be working in the same office with. It's kind of names that you see on the media kind of gave you quite a different perspective. So when you're being introduced to people like Dave Robson, the head of vehicle performance, other Williams members that sit on the pit wall during the race weekends, the race engineers, the strategists, you kind of think, wow, this is the team that I'm coming into. And it was also on my first day, that was the first time that I met Nicholas Latifi. So he was in for a simulator session. So I remember him being very friendly, coming over to us, introducing himself to us, as we'd be kind of working not as closely as obviously the race and performance engineers would do. But over the year, we had quite good opportunities to be able to deliver briefings and some of the weekend engineering debriefs and morning briefings directly to the drivers, which was quite at first nervous, but kind of you get into it, and it's really quite a surreal experience to be given that trust so early on in your career.
Yeah, it's a big sign from the team, right, that they're willing to put that trust in and to kind of take that bet on young talent, I suppose. I'm really interested to know what the kind of presentation of the role was when you first heard about it. Was that element of trust and kind of giving you kind of more responsibility than other comparative placements? Was that really what captured your interest there, if it wasn't so much just the dream of Formula One as a lifelong fan, but really the hands-on experience of what you'd actually be doing?
Yeah, so one of the things I remember about the Williams application process is throughout it, they love to drill in how much opportunity that we would be given as students. You wouldn't just be kind of sat below someone purely supporting their work. There was an area that I was responsible for during my year, and I felt like through that I could have a real direct impact in the performance of the team and the weekend. which makes such a difference and really motivates you kind of when you're working in that environment.
And it was a really interesting time in Formula One as well when you joined the team, because the teams are just coming out of COVID, where it's been a really interesting situation inside the factories. It was something that the teams had never experienced before, to have to manage this whole new style of working inside a factory. Did you see any almost hangover from that? Any processes that had changed throughout the year, or was it relatively structured and you saw continuity more than change throughout the year?
I don't think I saw so much change throughout the year. I think there was kind of the after effects of some of the COVID changes kind of following through, but also some stuff being reverted. So I think with COVID, they definitely introduced more rotations in the travelling personnel. So that meant there were a few more of the regular travelling personnel would sometimes be sitting in the ops room with us on the weekends. But in terms of the role that I was doing, I was kind of quite lucky that generally I was unaffected by COVID. So I was able to be in the office every day, kind of with my colleagues working there, which I felt was a much better alternative than having to possibly work 1, 2, maybe even more days remotely. I was able to be directly kind of in the office, learning from these brilliant engineers, and just taking the opportunity to continue to develop and help the team.
And in terms of when we look across leaders in the Formula One paddock, someone that always just seems to have that charisma and that enthusiasm that I love is Jost Capito, of course, your team principal. And it just feels like the enthusiasm that he brings to the workplace every day. And when I hear him talk about it in interviews, he talks about how it was communication across departments and kind of getting that open line of allowing the team to be the best it can be without any kind of recrimination or worry about doing anything wrong. Like, it was just trying to bring as many people together as possible to push the team forward. How did you feel Jost's management style put in place at the team? Or did you feel it, I suppose, is the real question.
I think possibly as an employee kind of below, just in the subset of the team, kind of within my vehicle performance department, we worked very well together. It was quite imperative, like we had to keep the communication levels absolutely top notch. So when you're working over on the weekends, speaking to each other on the intercom, it's a military-like code you almost follow. There's a structure for how you call someone, how you respond, and that structure helps everyone kind of maintain the highest level of communication during those time-pressured environments.
So in that time-pressured environment, was it Australia or suppose if we're 2021, it was Bahrain, right? Was that your first time inside the team in a race scenario? Do you remember what that first time session was and what kind of, from what you can tell me, what happened in that session?
Yeah, so I joined during summer of 2021. So my first race weekend was Belgium.
An interesting
Belgium,
one. That's right. Okay, right. Interesting.
It was definitely an interesting weekend. We had a bit of everything. I remember kind of the first live session was very much we're not gonna get you to do anything. Just kind of sit here and take it in, listen to what's going on over the radios, because there is so much behind the scenes that as an F1 fan or just an F1 follower, you just can't appreciate the magnitude of work and the amount of people that are supporting just running two cars effectively in a circle for an hour. And that kind of that initial experience of, wow, there's everyone looking at every detail of this car. And then you start to build from that. You think, okay, where does my role fit into this? Kind of you start to feel, okay, this is where I can have my contribution. This is where I can make a difference. And once you get comfortable with that, and once you get the appreciation of where you slot into the team, that's when I felt I could really start to add stuff, start to build.
So were you among like a class of kind of other people that were also starting placements at a similar time, or did you have anyone that was almost in the same situation as you that you got to work with, or was it mostly you being at the bottom of a quite tall power structure, giving that responsibility quickly, or did you kind of did you get to share that experience, I suppose is the question.
Yeah, so there were three of us based in the vehicle performance department, 3 placement students my year. So that was quite nice being able to have kind of people also on your level. that you could relate a bit more directly to. If you had issues, they knew roughly the work that you were following along with, and you could help each other out in that situation. And also one of the nice things about that particular Williams placement role is they've been running it quite a few years now. There's quite the follow-on of people that they've done the placement, they've gone back to university, and now they're back working as graduate vehicle performance engineers, and right up to the latest students, I guess, that date back would be an example of people who are currently fully fledged travelling performance engineers. So you kind of get to see how people have been in your position maybe 4 or 5 years ago, and how they've used that position that you're in currently to really develop and leap forward in their career.
So I'd love to jump back to when you first heard about the role. To the extent that you can, could you explain a little bit about the application process and maybe what advice you would have for people in the same position, right? As you're someone who's had success in this process, when you reflect back on that, what do you think it was about your application that drew the eye of the team?
Of course. So I think that the element of my application that really stood out is I really made an effort to tailor both my cover letter and CV, not just to the industry, to F1 that I was applying to, but actually to the role. I remember sitting down thinking, okay, I've got this role here in front of me. I love the sound of it. Vehicle performance. What might be some of the key skills that the employer is looking for the ideal employee to have? I was kind of looking, okay, right, teamwork. You've got to work effectively in that team. Communication comes into that as well. There were other elements also, kind of the data analysis side of things. Some of them they give to you on the job application. But I remember really applying some time to think about, okay, how can I really tailor my CV and cover letter so that when they read this, they think, okay, this could be our guy. This is the perfect application. Because if I was applying for kind of a different role, say aerodynamics at Williams, I would want to completely change parts of my cover letter and CV, because there are just skills and experiences that wouldn't relate to vehicle performance in the way that they might the aerodynamics design department.
So would you say? Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to summarise saying I really focused on what skills I think they might want me to demonstrate, because you've obviously only got a limited kind of page that you can work with your CV and cover letter, and you don't want to go on and on and on because they lose interest. So kind of keeping it clear, concise, and really shouting what I thought my key kind of standout points were that I could demonstrate in that role.
So Tom, could you just confirm one of the standout points was probably social services volunteering at Butler's Court? Would that be the kind of main thing that you would say got you the job? Because that's basically all I've got on mine. Would you say that's probably critical, or do I need to do a bit of extra work?
No, I'm afraid I don't think the social services volunteering at my old primary school made it on there, I'm afraid.
Okay, right, fair enough.
As an engineering student, I was able to draw on some of the project work that I'd done in first year, and that was one of the standout bits. I mean, a lot of people who go and do placements in F1 have done Formula Student, so I wasn't one of these people. So that's often a kind of a key example that you can really easily draw some skills from. But I was kind of determined not to let that hold me back. Look for other areas where I've demonstrated skills. So as a sports player through my hockey, I was really able to kind of show how I could be a team player, how my communication and leadership skills could come out through that. Even if kind of you look at hockey, you look at F1, you think maybe they're not so related. But a lot of the time when I was in the office working the ops room at the weekend, it feels like you're playing a team sport. You're all in it together. You all have that aim of maximising the performance of the car. At the end of the day, if you don't work together, you're not going to succeed. So that's kind of, for me, that's what I enjoyed so much about working at the weekends and working in that ops support role, is it felt like you were playing a team sport. You'd win together, but you'd also lose together. But at the end of the day, you're all working together towards that one goal.
So that first weekend in Belgium 2021, for Williams, that is a huge moment in their history, right? You're going in as a new member of the team, and everyone is celebrating like this is the best thing that's happened in, maybe even the last 2-3 years at Williams. how did your perspective on that kind of situation play out? It seems like a really interesting place to be at that time.
Yeah, it was pretty surreal. I think coming into that week, obviously we just had Hungary before the summer break, so picking up some points there for Williams. There was already quite a good morale in the team, and then it does seem to be that Williams have fairly strong performance in the wet. We saw it recently with Nicholas Latifi reaching Q3 in Great Britain. I think
that's a good point.
You can say the Williams car might perform better in the wet, but at the end of the day, it doesn't take away the fact that George was able to put a Williams car that did not have the natural pace of a front row car and put it P2. And the emotions of the team, I think at the factory, it probably wasn't quite as elevated as some of the celebrations that you see at the track. I mean, that race and that red flag period was so long and so drawn out. It kind of actually, it didn't feel like you were getting closer to the end. You were getting closer to that podium. It was almost just handed to you. And yes, of course, we had the chance to go out and celebrate, but it was a strange kind of celebration. But everyone was still immensely happy and over the moon that we had got Williams' first podium for at least a couple of years, I think.
Yeah, I think it was Lance Stroll, I think, has had to be the one before that, right? At Baku. I can't think of any other besides that. But how did from that point then, I suppose 2019, once George's move to Mercedes 2021, once George's move to Mercedes got wrapped up, that was another moment in the history of Williams, right? That they had served kind of this driver, taken him from Formula 2, spent those years at Williams and developed that connection with Mercedes and demonstrated they could be a team to take, one of the best young British talents and move him up that ladder to Formula 1. How do you look now to the future of Williams, right? You got a new driver coming in next year. Do you know who it's going to be? I don't know who it's going to be.
I don't know who it's going to be either, I'm afraid.
All right, Tom. All right. I don't know if I believe you, but we'll see. We'll see. It should be pretty exciting though, right? Alex came into the team and really stepped up that second car. The gap that George had left was almost a perfect opportunity for Alex to get in there. Did you work with him the same way you worked with Nicholas?
Yeah. So both the drivers, we had opportunities to kind of work with them. So a lot in the role that I was doing with the drivers, we'd look at their pit lane performance. So we'd be looking at how competitive they were in the overall time that they'd spend in the pit lane compared to other drivers. So although you might only enter the pits once or twice in the race, all the time you're looking for any little margin that you can get over anyone. So we'd break stuff down. We'd look at the driving style when you're entering the box, your driving style launching out of the box as well, how well the drivers are stopping on the marks. Box positioning can have quite a large impact on your pit stop times. But there's kind of a balance that you need to get. So you might be able to really nail down your box positioning so that you're perfect every single time. But the cost of doing that might mean you're slightly slower coming into the pit box. So you might then lose more time in that pit box entry phase than you would actually kind of in the pit stop time. So there's all those balances and finding the perfect balance in the middle, really, of where you can get that maximum performance out of the car and out of the drivers. So we'd work on them with that, and kind of every weekend between myself and one of the other placement students would rotate in giving these briefings, working with the drivers to really maximise the performance of themselves in the pit lane.
So that's something that changes massively between track locations and also track styles, right? The difference between a Monaco pit lane versus a Silverstone is huge and must have big consequences. Is that something you would focus on week to week? Is the uniqueness of different pit lanes and how, I guess, they can be exploited and you can take the maximum advantage that is available there?
Yeah, of course, you'd always tailor your advice to the pit lane and the track you have that week. There's so many different factors that can affect your pit stop. It's stuff even like the tarmac conditions, your distance between the pit box that you're in and whoever you've got in front and behind you. There's stuff also that even the camber of the pit lane, even just a few different degrees, that might affect how well your jacks are performing in the pit stop. The visibility, of course, for the drivers coming in, whether they feel more natural driving into the left or the right. And you can look kind of back at previous years, see, okay, back in 2020, we were really strong in the pit lane. Why was this? What were we doing well? Is there anything that we can look at maybe in competitors who've always been quite strong in the pit lane? Can we learn off of them and apply some of the findings of those investigations to our drivers?
And it's also the finishing position in the constructor standings, right, is deciding your position relative to the other teams in the pit lane, like the order there. Is that much of a variable? Like, is there a significant advantage to being further up the pit lane? Or I guess it's all contextual because it depends if you're near to someone, like that's going to play a bigger role. Is that something you think about? I'm not trying to do your job. I'm just trying to think like what when I think of factors important in a pit stop, it is something's got to be different, right? Depending on where you are in that pit lane.
Yeah, so obviously if you're first or last in the pit lane, you definitely get a bit of an advantage.
Right.
But I think most people would take a championship position over being the last spot in the pit lane.
Yeah, that's a good point. That is a good point.
Last spot in the pit lane, you've got a nice straight launch out, which definitely helps. And then also coming in, if you're the first box in the pit lane, you quite often have a slightly easier line, possibly, depending on where the FIA set up their weighbridge. And sometimes if you look closely, kind of at that first box in the pit lane, you might see the angle of it is a bit different to the angle of some of the others. So sometimes you can work a bit with the pit box skew, especially if you're that first box, you can angle it. So you're launching out into the fast lane, as opposed to what most other teams do is that they set up so that your pit box is actually angled. So you're almost, if you look at how the car launches, it almost looks like it should be launching into the garages, but the driver's applying quite a
because then it oversteers back, right? Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So the so what else then? What was something that you showed up and were kind of surprised by? You were like, oh, I never thought about that, or that's like something. I don't know. Maybe that's something that you also couldn't tell me, but like I'm just trying to imagine. There's got to be a huge number of things. You know, going in with that engineering background, you've been learning a huge amount about performance and all these different kind of contexts, but there's still so much to learn from that hands-on experience. So is there some examples of things where you were super surprised, or things that you were like, oh wow, they really have thought about everything, right? Because that's what the Formula One teams are there to do, is to consider every tiny little possible detail. Is there anything that comes to mind, or am I just waffling?
No, you're definitely not waffling. And going into the year, everyone does say, F1 teams have data and everything. And that definitely was the thing that got me. There is some sort of spreadsheet tracker database that has the value, whether it's from 5 years ago, 5 races ago. It might just be it might be as simple as lap times. It might be as simple as pit stop times. But there is some sort of tracker for every single bit of data that you can imagine, which is quite insane. And then obviously on top of all of that, you have all of the car data. You have all of these hundreds of telemetry files that are coming directly off the car, live to the engineers, both trackside and back at the factory. So it's almost to the point that it's so much data. Obviously, you can't deal with it. It's seeing how can we make the data more useful to us, and what can we get from it, and how can we really use it effectively.
Because there's an element of opportunity cost there, right? If you spend, when you're doing something, you could also be doing something else. So the efficiency of kind of spending your time in the right areas. And I think, I'm not sure if it was Jost, but it was one of the team principals in an interview said, everyone in their team delivers their 10th of a second towards the car, right? And then you add that all together, and that's kind of what brings the performance, and it's a good way of looking at, the input and how that kind of cumulative effect of everyone putting in that hard work throughout the team plays out. I did forget where that question was going, but it was something about, gonna have to cut this now. What was I gonna say? Oh, the next question I had was, did you get out to the track throughout the year, right? What was that experience like? What was it, seeing a pit lane, in theory versus in reality? I got there eventually.
I did, yes. I had quite an awesome experience. So I was flown out to Austria for one of the Pirelli tyre
Awesome.
tests early this year. So that was my first experience of an F1 car running. That was my first experience of any kind of racetrack.
Wow.
So for me, it was all, wow, this is kind of so much more than I'd ever expected. Kind of purely just hearing the F1 car fire up there in the garage, feeling the heat coming off of it is one thing that you don't get at all at home. Those garages with those exhausts get so hot, and they have the extractors coming out, but it doesn't get around it. And I can't imagine what it was like for some of the guys and girls out in Singapore with the humidity there. But yes, so Austria was my first experience being trackside, and it was a great experience. Kind of have the chance to be there alongside some of the more senior engineers, to sit and stand with them in the engineering island, in the garages, see the kind of stuff they're looking at, see how they kind of act, and the whole trackside operation side of things is quite different to the factory based side. It's another level up, but not in a it's another level up in the possibly the hours, the workload, what you've got to produce, but not in a bad way. In a way that you aspire to think, well, you know what I do in the factory, yeah, that's pretty good, but how can I step it up the next level? That to get to that trackside role where you get closer to the car, you get closer to having that impact on the car, and as you say, that tenth of a second that comes from each team. Well, within each team, you have each individual that's giving their share of that tenth of a second. And how can you up your share to really, can you even push that beyond the tenth of a second, and to get closer to the car and just see how everyone operates and works, and to be able to learn off some of the engineers was such an incredible experience. And I felt very lucky to have the chance to do that.
And going into the technical changes that we had this year, right, the huge kind of aerodynamic reshuffle, I suppose, and the ground effect cars, does that have a knock-on effect into the pit stop performance, or is it more easy to transfer something like what your role was year on year than it would be for an aerodynamicist going from 21 to 22? It's got to be a huge redesign for them. Did you feel that play out in your department at all? Or I suppose if you're just there for that year, it wasn't something that was too dealt with, maybe?
So the nice thing about my placement is I was able to span kind of 2 seasons almost. So I got the end of the 2021 season into the 2022 season. So I got a taste of that developmental change, and pit stop related. Obviously, the main thing for us was the tyres changed this year. So they're much larger, which obviously comes with the increased weight. So there were challenges kind of making sure that the crew were able to deal with those increased weights, increased sizes. We also had some difficulties with the wheel covers we now have. So those wheel covers give you less opportunity to grip the inside of the wheel. So you've got to be a bit smarter about where your hands are positioning when you're taking the wheel off. And you also had other things like the mud guards on the front wheels. They can be a little bit of an obstruction if you're just being a bit lazy with some of your hand placements. So there was quite a lot of pre-season kind of, how can we best prepare ourselves? So obviously everyone's in this same situation. We know the wheels are changing. We know it's going to possibly be a little bit harder. Kind of how can we put in the work now to get ahead for next season? So that was quite an interesting kind of bit of work to be involved with, and looking at kind of, okay, we're not in the peak season now, but we can still keep pushing on. Kind of the work doesn't drop. You kind of think, okay, there are no races. Does that mean I can sit back for 3 months now and take a bit of a jolly? And of course, we all had a rest at the end of the season, but kind of always, as soon as we got back from Christmas, you're back in it. The new season, it rapidly comes up. It rapidly approaches. So there were all those pre-season developments, but on top of that, there's always continual small developments that you're always trying to do to optimize your performance. So obviously, with the designers, they're never satisfied. They always think that can be something a little bit better. There's always possibly a weight saving. There's always possibly a performance saving. And I think one of the tricky things with trying to find a performance gain pit stop related is the data you work with isn't quite as arbitrary. You can't have a robot put a pit stop wheel on and off 100 times and then put another wheel on and off 100 times, and you can say, okay, well, wheel B was much faster than wheel A, so let's go with design of wheel B. In some of your assessment of is design A or design B better, you're using humans, you're using mistakes, and that was quite an interesting kind of data analysis problem to try and say, okay, well, we've got this data, how can we filter out what we think are kind of your expected anomalies versus your anomalies that wouldn't happen on a daily basis, to try and assess how we're kind of shaping ourselves towards the most performant design for a particular element of a pit stop.
Yeah, and I'd love to know, like, how does someone go from just being an engineer, like maybe what you would then graduate into, that kind of role, to actually being on the pit stop team, because that's such a specific thing. And it's always a moment of excitement, from the viewer side in the races. Oh, they're going into the pits. Who's going to be fastest, right? We always see that time pop up and you think, between like 2 and 3 is like, oh, pretty decent. 3 and 5 is like, oh, wasn't that bad. If it's above 5 and there's no front wing change, then something's gone wrong, right? It's such a high pressure role, and it is something that you see very tangibly play a big role in the races, more than maybe the other tenths of a second that the people back at the factory are delivering. Those ones in the pit stop are, there's a lot of eyeballs on them. What's the interaction between someone who is in your role and the people who are, physically doing those pit stops?
So there's over a race weekend, the pit crew, so they're just the mechanics, normal mechanics in the garage.
So they do other stuff besides.
So that kind of their full-time job is not to be a gunman. Kind of on the Wednesday, on the Thursday, they're out at the track, they're building up the cars. They've got a job to do throughout the whole of the weekend, and then pit stops is essentially just a little bit on the side of that they have to do Sunday during the race, because obviously, hopefully, we'll say you're not building up your car during Sundays, because it should be all ready to go. So for them, pit stops isn't everything, but they are ultra competitive. They want to be the fastest pit stop. Okay, they might not be able to control if you've got the fastest car, but they can have their impact on whether our pit stops are the fastest or the slowest that week. And for them, they love it. And part of the role that I was doing was looking through the data and the videos that we got from the trackside practice and live pit stops, and then creating feedback and reports to help those guys on a daily basis. Get feedback while out at the track on where the issues might be, where the performance gains might be, and just kind of keeping them motivated with, this is how your progress is going throughout the weekend, that we started here, we're now here. And there's a lot of more, just even in a pit stop, it's not just individual effort. There is so much cohesion you need between a trio on a wheel. So you have the man taking the wheel off, your gun man who's got a gun on and gun off, and then the man bringing the wheel on as well. And if those three don't synchronize up well together, then it limits the whole of your pit stop. So you kind of got to take the opportunity kind of throughout the weekend. If you've got a trio that haven't worked together, you've got to try and quickly build that synergy. And it's really important to get those guys working together as quickly as possible, because otherwise you could have 3 wheels that are on and off the car under 2 seconds. But if your fourth wheel is changed within 5, that is still a 5-second pit stop. And ultimately, it's every little gain you can find anywhere you'll take. So part of my role was giving that feedback on where we're winning, where we're losing, where it might be potential to find time, looking at how the guys are positioned, possibly is there other technique changes that we could implement in a certain mechanic that might help them a bit more. And I think another thing that also came into it with the kind of the longer season that we now have, and then also the heavier wheels, it's actually injury prevention. So you need to be careful that you don't send 22 guys out to the first race and they all batter themselves up so much that 5 of them are now unavailable for the second race of the season, because obviously you've got a fixed pool of mechanics that you can rely on to do the job. And and you don't really want to send someone up to the track who might be able to build up the car, but can complete in a pit stop. Because obviously that would possibly mean you then have to fly someone else out. You then use up an operational pass doing that. It also costs money, which is cost cap. So it's all about kind of being intelligent, I guess, with the resources, which in this case are the mechanics that you have.
That's really interesting. You mentioned the cost cap there. I would love to touch on that, of course, with the current context. Beyond Williams, pretty chilled at the moment, but at the top of Formula One, it's all getting a bit spicy with this cost cap stuff. Did you feel that? I mean, you must have, right? In the factory, you feel the fact that Williams were changing their operation because of the cost cap, right? What ways did you feel that, if at all?
So I think there wasn't so much that I felt directly in my day-to-day role, because I was so much focused on that kind of performance of the car, always trying to get the performance out of that. There obviously, I think Williams made quite a lot of investment, kind of hardware-wise, to kind of boost their production capacity.
Right, because the new ownership, right, that's a huge change. The team's still called Williams, and the factory, like the heritage is all carried over. But in a lot of ways, that new ownership is another significant point in the history of the team. So then, tying that in with the cost cap is huge, right? And the investment they had made, it was super important that it was the right places and giving the team that advantage.
Yeah, definitely. It's all kind of being intelligent with how you devote your resources. You kind of, I guess, a lot of what we did was how can we be intelligent with the people that we have. So we're limited, I guess, budget and cost cap wise in the number of people that you can have within the department. So it's kind of looking at how can we best allocate, certain jobs, certain roles, and is there stuff that might have to be dropped purely because you can't cover it with the personnel? And obviously, yes, the investment, it's great for Williams to be right up there spending kind of the maximum of the cost cap budget. But at the same time, when you're already a step behind, it's more than just the money you spend. It's all about how efficient can you be with that money, because you've got people that are fixed kind of 5 minutes up the road from you. How can you start clawing back that time, because they're also spending at the maximum, so they're going forward as you're going forward, and how can you take that advantage that they have within that budget, and how can you be most efficient with what you've got? And it makes F1 really quite interesting, and I think the longer the cost cap is in, the more you'll start to see it with teams starting to come together as the kind of the pre-cost cap infrastructure investments that you had from teams like Merck, Red Bull, that were able to spend, as kind of the benefits of those slowly degrade as the technology becomes a bit older, becomes a bit more expensive for them to maintain them. Do you then see the teams that didn't have this start to catch up with them a bit more?
And also for Williams, there is an element, right? There's this kind of division we see in Formula One between what you would call a factory team and a customer team, right? Basically someone that's not making their own powertrains versus someone that is. But also there are other parts on the car, right? Was there tech involved in the Williams pit stop that was designed outside of the Williams factory? And how did you kind of bridge those two things? Or was it mostly controlled in-house?
So it was all mostly controlled in-house, the Williams pit stop equipment, as far as I know. Obviously, there are always some standard parts in kind of every kind of engineering, production, design that you're going to buy in. But it wasn't like in cases you see with Red Bull and AlphaTauri, where AlphaTauri kind of have the same wheel nuts, have the same wheel guns as Red Bull. All of the wheel gun, wheel nut development, all of the pit stop rig. So the kind of not even just the pressure lines, but also the kind of the underlying release system that you have. All of that is also built and maintained in-house. And then that was all part of something that kind of in my role I was building on. So there was a pre-existing code that did a lot of the pit stop analysis, and kind of every year it's handed down to each placement student and they add their twist. They add their extra bit of, okay, this can make it a little bit better, and you have that kind of continual development of just little bits of games where you can.
So who are Williams' main rivals at the moment then? Because you mentioned, the how the 2022 changes are playing out, and you've got the cost cap to kind of bring the teams closer together. I mean, even just in the kind of points distribution, yes, we do have Red Bull a long way forward at the top, but further back in the constructor standings, the midfield and the lower kind of teams are closer than they have been in previous years, right? So how does Williams do you look at the other teams and think, right, our rivals for this weekend are, I don't know, the Aston Martins or the Hasses or the Saubers? I guess how does Williams look at other teams, or do you, I suppose, try just not to worry about them because you're only in control of what you can do yourself?
I think you don't really know until after Saturday qualifying who's really going to be your close competitors during the race. You can see sometimes, kind of, let's take an extreme version. Let's take Monaco. If somehow if you qualify a Williams P10 and you have McLaren P11, P12 behind you for that weekend, you'll say, okay, those McLarens are our close competitors. But if you were to qualify P18 and you had an Aston Martin either side of you, I think for that race you'd say those Astons are your target to make sure you beat them. I think it can be quite a weekend and track dependent item, because obviously everyone kind of has the same car, but not everyone is always going to find the maximum performance out of that car every single weekend. There will be some weekends where Williams might get their setup wrong, and they might have a car that isn't at the maximum of what it should be, or the same for other teams. And at that point you say, okay, we can capitalize on. If you've got Lewis Hamilton not happy with the setup of his car, he ends up near the back of the grid. You can say, okay, we can pounce on that. That is a position that we can gain. I would say that there's never really anyone you want to say, I'm not going to race you, and unless it's obviously a blue flag coming through, mm-hmm. or a leader who doesn't have the pace who you don't have the pace to keep with. I think you always look to how can we in this race get as many positions as possible, even if I think one of the things that I personally didn't realise quite so much when I came into Williams, and I think probably a lot of fans as well, is that even if you're not fighting for P10, you're fighting for a lower position than that, you're still fighting for as high a position as you can, or to minimise your overall race time as much as you can. Even if you're P18, in the last 2 laps, I'm sure you'll still look to deploy every bit of energy that you have left in the car to just absolutely maximise that race time. It's not necessarily a question of, are we going to win points? There's always that racing pride there that I found with Williams, which I think's something I've always enjoyed. I don't think there's ever been a race where everyone's kind of just put their heads down and said, you know what, we're done here. We're not going to try. There's always been a spark, a hope. You never know what could happen. We are going to keep pushing right to the last lap and keep getting as much out of this race as we can. And I think that was something that in my placement year really drove me on and really motivated me to help working for the team and help fighting for the team.
That's amazing. In terms of now, watching Formula One, given the experience you've had and the kind of all the plethora of huge knowledge that it imparted you with, how has it changed the way you now watch a live Formula One race? Of course, you're watching Williams, primarily, I suppose, to see what they're doing and the people you now know on the inside of that team and the car. How does it inform the way you watch a race live now? And are there things that other fans could kind of, maybe something they wouldn't typically look for that you could tell them about, maybe?
Yeah, so I found it quite the transition going from working kind of in the ops room, looking at all those data channels that we had on the car. I also had the GPS data, and then suddenly just going back to a single TV feed with
For
just
sure,
a thin timing strip on the side was quite a, well, I'm not sure what's going on there, or why has he just had an overtake there. So I've struggled to relate back to to how I did my job. But at the same time, I think it's allowed me to enjoy it kind of as a sporting event more than such a kind of, right, I'm going to focus in on someone and think, how can that person get to the highest position in their race? So I think it's made me enjoy watching F1 more, but it's definitely made me watch it with a different perspective. I think the amount of pit stop work I've done, I now look at a pit stop and I can say, oh, they've had a problem on the right front there, or
Sure.
something else has gone on, and kind of see from the many pit stop videos I watched over my placement year what might have caused that. But I think I'd say I definitely focus on the timing page a lot more, for some reason. Possibly maybe just because I'm more of a numbers based person. I think always have been, doing engineering, but definitely numbers over literacy. So kind of looking at that, seeing, okay, how am I seeing the numbers progress lap to lap? Does it look like someone who maybe isn't being shown on the TV is moving up? You sometimes see when people pit and it's not necessarily shown on the TV, and kind of trying to keep a semi eye on the overall picture of the race through that, because obviously with the TV, it's hard for them to show everyone's race. You've got 20 drivers out there, and each 20 driver is going to have an individual race that it's not possible to show all 20 at once. Kind of, even when we were working at Williams, you focus on your two drivers, and you might know that Max is first and Charles is second, but you don't really know the intricacies of why they're first and second right now. You see their general strategies. Obviously, the strategists will be paying quite close attention to that, looking if maybe the race up front is going to affect our race, with the blue flags.
Yeah, it's a key. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, if we could maybe apply that kind of way of watching the racing going into Circuit of the Americas this weekend, we've got, I think I'm pretty sure if like Max and Perez both finish in and around the top 5, that's the constructors title wrapped up too for Red Bull. So we're kind of going into this final wing of the season where we're seeing the battle at the front die down, but that battle lower down in the constructors table is just as important, right? Those points are worth just as much. Doesn't really matter what's happening up front, and ultimately, points is cash, right, for these teams towards the back of the grid. It's huge for the sponsors on the car, and also, as you mentioned, the motivation of the people in the team to finish strong in the year. Maybe if we start with the pit lane, what's the pit lane at COTA like from your memory?
Pit lane at COTA. Well, I think it's quite typically American. It's very large. From what I
you can't do that, Tom. You can't say that. That's horrible.
Sorry.
Oh, how's that not on the NDA? That's brutal.
I meant in terms of
love.
Yeah, but I wasn't referring to the people. I was talking about.
No, me neither. It's getting hot in here, isn't it?
It's going to be hot.
Okay, so right. it's a large pit lane in terms of width.
Yeah, it's a very wide pit lane. That's not going to be in it, is it?
Oh, I mean, we're definitely going to leave that in. That's a high quality comedy moment. But the width that makes it easier, a little bit easier, right? For the drivers, you're less likely to get one of those unsafe releases where there's a little bit more reaction time, a little bit more gap for that. And I guess that probably comes from like IndyCar and NASCAR, right, where they run more cars. So I suppose the scale of those pit lanes is. I'm trying to rationalize your brutal attack on the American people here, Tom. But so all right, so it's a wide pit lane. What's the speed limit? Is it a relatively slow speed limit, high speed limit? What's that like?
I believe speed limit is your standard 80 kph in COTA, and then I think the pit exit is quite interesting, going up the hill with the cars braking into turn 1. So obviously you get the inside line there, and I think possibly turn 1 could be an interesting one to watch with the bumps that we usually see at COTA. So obviously porpoising has been early on in this season quite an issue in F1.
For sure.
and it does seem to have settled down kind of recently. But it's always been the tracks typically that have had quite a few bumps that have always had an effect of inducing that porpoising. So that might be something that we possibly see come back on those Friday and Saturday practice sessions. Kind of Baku was a great example of how you could always take two different lines down the main straight, and if you hit a bump on one of the lines, the car would start porpoising, but you'd be completely fine on the other. So I think that will be a good challenge for the drivers to discover and delve into.
And in terms of track dynamics, it's a really cool mix of, it's got those S's in the first sector, but it also has room for those high speed straights, and it's got the slow speed corners. It's got a real kind of mix of everything. It's a long lap right around Kota. So in terms of like balancing the engineering on the cars, it's a huge challenge for them, right? When you're trying to think, well, we need the downforce, but you can't have too much downforce, and to kind of draw that whole picture together, it's going to be a very significantly different challenge coming from Japan, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, every circuit is going to have its challenges, and all the teams going into the weekend, they'll have run their simulations. They'll be looking, okay, this is what the simulation says the optimum setup's going to be. But in reality, once you get to the track, everything can change. Sometimes your model's a little bit off. You haven't quite got your numbers right, and you're discovering actually we're struggling through those high speed S's. So we might need to make a change to the car that is going to compromise us somewhere else. But often it's a necessary compromise. And what some of the teams might be thinking about is kind of DRS zones. We've got that very long back straight. Is there a way that you can kind of weight your car performance in that sector of the track compared to another car, so that you can always be gaining on lap time in that sector, lose a bit on the other, but because you're giving yourself a greater chance of getting that DRS or possibly getting out of range of another car's DRS, it might be a worthwhile trade-off that you give yourself for that extra possible race performance, although it might come at the cost of possibly a place or two in qualifying.
And we did see from De Vries, right, at Monza, he was able to stay in the points because of the merits of the Williams car, at that track, but also in the high speed sections of that track. So if it's possible for the team, hopefully, to achieve some sort of balance there, I'm not sure if you'd love to answer this, but if you could make a prediction, maybe like beyond where the Williams cars might be, but maybe further towards the front, with the knowledge that you have, do you see the rest of the season falling further towards Verstappen like it has kind of in this whole second half? Do you think it's an unbeatable partnership at the moment for those guys at the front?
Yeah, I think from my personal perspective, that race pace of Verstappen at the moment, it just seems to be unmatchable. He is just on another step compared to everyone else. We've seen it quite a few times recently. He's not qualified well, or there have been other issues in that. But then still, despite that, in kind of your standard dry racing conditions, he can just find at least an extra tenth or two, kind of to Checo, to the Ferraris. And kind of if you're in Ferrari's position, almost no matter what strategy you do, you can't beat a faster car. It's as simple as that. You can try your best. You can split the strategies, you can try hold him up, but at the end of the day, when you've got a car and a driver that are so in tune and performing so well, there is little you can do to stop that. So my prediction is that Max will continue to run away with it for now.
I remember I said to Jonathan that the interview I did with Jonathan Wheatley was before the start of 2021. And we tried to skip over most of what happened at the end of 2021, but I did say, we did like a pre-season prediction section, and I remember saying, if your car and Max Verstappen keep getting faster, it could be a real problem, because he just seems to run away at the start of the races. And yeah, it's exactly right. Like Ferrari, they can try an alternate strategy, but you're thinking, well, if you're going to go alternate to Red Bull, they've probably got the best one already figured out. So if you're going to go alternate to it, all you know is it's just going to be alternate to what is probably already the best strategy that they're doing. Do you think, you mentioned how the teams should draw closer together. I suppose we're yet to await whether Red Bull get any penalty for their cost cap accounting book cooking, I suppose. But are we going to bring the kind of the top three teams together next year? Do you think we'll have a closer fight than we've had this year, or is that something that again is, you know, you can't really see until the Saturday of Australia next year?
I think again it's something that will be hard to predict. You don't know what everyone's got up their sleeves. Kind of Mercedes have this completely different concept to everyone else with the kind of the no side pods. If they were next year to bring out a car that looks more like a Red Bull or more like a Ferrari, does that mean they are still a whole season behind kind of Red Bull and Ferrari in their understanding of that car? And will that still hinder them, or will they have caught up in that time? Or there could be another factor. Someone could bring an entirely new concept, and not necessarily one of the front three teams, but someone else that has more performance than kind of any of the top three cars that we've seen at the moment. So I'm sure all the teams will keep pushing, and hopefully some of the budget cap and the wind tunnel and CFD restrictions based on championship position might help bring some of that together. And ultimately, you've got that at the moment for a lot of teams, that balance of, do you keep developing the car that you've got at the moment, or are you have you shifted over your focus to next year's car already? Are you kind of looking at, you can say, okay, this season we can't do much more for this car, or whatever we would do, not necessarily going to be worth it for the championship point gain, or the kind of the amount of our budget cap that we use for that. So I think it's going to be quite tricky to judge until we see the cars on track for the first time.
Absolutely, because I remember towards the end of last year, people were saying that, look, we've seen Red Bull for the first time in this era of regulations have a car that they think could compete for the driver's title, and that everyone was thinking, oh, they must be diverting too many resources to their 2021 car, and we're going to see this drop off, right? And I guess I'm sure you must have seen it many times from your perspective working on the inside, but there's just that huge gap of what people will say week to week in the media versus what the reality of you know, the causal factors at play that are really kind of making these cars go quickly. There can always be a huge gap there. And yeah, I think you're exactly right to say we just can't say too early. But I've got to come up with something interesting to say, I suppose. I wanted to finish up with just a little look to the future and hopefully the future of your role at the team. Is the ultimate goal to be in the race team mechanic and maybe even end up on one of the wheel guns one day? What do you think of you know, where the role could evolve into?
So for me, the kind of the goal at the moment is to work into being a performance engineer. So much more focused on the car's performance. I think that the mechanics side of things, it's kind of a bit too hands-on for where my interests lie. So I'm very interested in the data and the analysis side of things, which you wouldn't really get in that mechanics role. So I'm kind of looking at furthering my understanding of kind of your car performance, car setup, how you monitor a car's performance kind of during the race. So kind of taking these next two years that I've got at university to keep furthering that knowledge, and then hopefully after graduating, going back into motorsport and kind of working on that career path, hopefully with the aim of maybe one day becoming a race engineer, seeing how it goes.
Yeah, that'd be incredible, mate. You know, you got the harm, you got the hockey captain experience, be calm over the radio. I would love to know, just in your opinion, who do you think would be good in that seat for next year? I know if you do know, you don't have to tell me. Maybe you don't know, but do you think maybe someone like Logan Seargant is a good option there, or we've seen most of the rest of the dominoes fall in the driver market, haven't we? So it's kind of the last storyline is going to be that seat next to Alex. I'm sure it was also very tough. You know, there was a lot of conversation about it, but working with Nicky and then knowing that he's not going to be in that race seat anymore, that is got to be tough, right? No matter what the performance on track is, it's someone who had the dream job, you know, of any racing driver in the world and can't do it anymore, is looking to be replaced. I suppose it's a two-part question, right? What's that experience like, knowing that Nicky's no longer going to be there, and then where do you see the future of that seat going?
Yeah, well, it will obviously be sad to see Nicky leave Lee Williams. He was always such a friendly face in the factory. He would always make an effort that when he came in for those simulator sessions, he would go around the tables and make sure that he said hello to everyone, and he was a very energetic and positive presence a lot of the time. So it definitely will be sad to see him leave Williams. But I think for that Williams seat, I mean, Logan Sargent, if you were to put him in the car, obviously a great promotion for some American owners. So obviously Doralton would be quite happy with that. You'd obviously help captivate a bit more of an American following for the team. I think there are also other benefits in bringing in someone who has a bit more experience nowadays. You see the kind of the potential impacts that crashes can have on your developments that you can bring. We saw with Haas, they had to bring Mick Schumacher's upgrade about a race or two after they brought Kevin Magnussen's, purely because they didn't have the production capability to bring both upgrades as early as they would have liked. So I think in that sense, there's definitely merit and advantages to having someone in that seat with possibly a little bit more experience, just kind of settle into the team, get the team going, and kind of help push them slowly up the grid.
So what you're saying is I should go Jost Capito at Williams.com, no salary, give me a test and we'll see what happens.
I think it's always worth a go.
I reckon we could get Jack Threlfall podcast on the side of the car. And you mentioned Logan Sargent. Going into this weekend, right? I know you're not on the branding marketing team, but if you were, it would be a good time to announce it.
It definitely would be a good time to announce it, especially with him in the car for FP1.
Exactly.
I think it'll be a great experience for him to get another run in an F1 car, especially one of the 2022 ones, and kind of keep his development going forwards with the team.
And we've also got that American path developing with McLaren. They're looking to 2 IndyCar drivers they've got upcoming, getting their tests in there. And it is a point, it's a predictable thing to say, but the next evolutions of Formula One seem to be happening mostly across the pond in America, right? Is that something that the teams are well aware of and looking to take advantage of? I suppose Williams maybe more than most because of the new ownership.
Yeah, I think it's something that you've definitely seen in all the teams, especially kind of looking at the advertising and marketing side of things. You could see kind of how many teams kind of really pushed for a bit of a specialty marketing kind of experience around Miami. So Williams was one of the teams to release kind of special merchandise. I think Alpine as well, others, McLaren, probably most of them really, because I think America is becoming such an emerging market for Formula One. Obviously, you're going to have 3 races in America next year, which is kind of quite a significant proportion of the calendar for just one country to host. So I think teams would be kind of napping almost if they weren't to try and get on that bandwagon of really bringing in those American fans.
All right, fantastic. Well, I think I've crossed off everything on my list, and we've got an incredible preview there of just what we're going to be looking forward to this weekend. And yeah, hopefully we can wrap up a really exhilarating Formula One season, and we can have Tom back on once he's in his race engineer. And we need you when it comes up on the broadcast, when they do the little beep beep noise and they do a little bit of team radio. I want to hear your voice, Tom, saying, yeah, that's P1 Alex, pole position. I reckon that's not too far away, right?
Hopefully not.
All right, fantastic. Well, we'll let the outro music play, and I'll say a big thank you from me, Tom. This has been a really great episode, full of great insight and advice. And I don't know why my camera's suddenly gone crazy, but it's decided that it's time. There we go. Decided that it's time to wrap up the episode. So yeah, sorry. Massive thank you for coming on, and I'll be back next week with more of the Jack Threlfall Show.
Thank you very much for having me.